Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for being here tonight. It truly means a lot that you choose to watch this channel. I've got a spine-chilling collection of scary stories set in the rain for you to enjoy. But before we dive in, take a moment to get comfortable, relax, and let the darkness take over. And hey, if you enjoy these stories, don't forget to subscribe, never miss out on any of the eerie tales that we share. Sit back, relax, and let's get started. In the fall of 2017, Laura was in need of a fresh start after going through a difficult breakup. She had spent weeks searching for a new place to live, a home that would offer peace and solitude, far away from the chaos of her previous life. Finally, she found what seemed to be the perfect house. It was a quaint 3-bedroom, located in a quiet suburban neighborhood that appeared to be almost abandoned. Only 5 other families lived on the block, and there was only one house adjacent to hers. Laura's new life seemed to be on the right track. Her nearest neighbor, Grace, lived in the house next door. Grace was a middle-aged woman who, from a distance, appeared to be kind yet distant. At first, Laura didn't think much of her. Grace wasn't overly friendly, but she wasn't hostile either. She was simply there, always on her porch, always watching. From the first day Laura moved in, she noticed Grace sitting outside on her front porch in an old, creaky wooden chair. Grace was there every single day, at all hours, never saying a word, never moving much. She would just sit there, staring in the direction of Laura's house. This struck Laura as odd, but she tried to shrug it off. Perhaps Grace was simply lonely. Laura had moved in to find some peace herself, so she understood the desire to sit in silence. But it wasn't long before the unease began to creep in. Every time Laura stepped outside, whether to water her plants, take out the trash, or get the mail, Grace was there. Her eyes would follow Laura's every movement, but she never spoke, not even a polite nod of acknowledgement. She simply sat there, staring. It wasn't long before Laura found herself avoiding being outside when Grace was on the porch. She didn't like the way Grace's cold eyes seemed to follow her, tracking her movements with an eerie intensity. The few other neighbors she saw around town didn't seem to interact with Grace either. Everyone kept to themselves. Laura had initially thought she would welcome the quietness, but Grace's presence made the peace unsettling. It got to the point where Laura would glance out her window just to check if Grace was watching. More often than not, she was. Day or night, Grace was there. She never waved, never called out. She just watched, her face expressionless. Laura started keeping her curtains drawn all the time, but that didn't help much. Even when she couldn't see Grace, she knew Grace was there. Days turned into weeks, and the watching became unbearable. Then, things got even stranger. Laura started noticing that small objects in her house began to disappear. At first, it was little things she could easily overlook. A spoon from her kitchen drawer, a comb from her bathroom, a book she had been reading that mysteriously vanished from her nightstand. Laura assumed she was misplacing things due to the stress of the move and her new life. But the missing items kept adding up, so much so that Laura started keeping mental notes of where she left things, just to reassure herself that she wasn't imagining it. The more disturbing aspect, though, was her house itself. Things in her home didn't feel quite right. Windows that she had closed and locked would be found slightly open when she returned from work. Lights she was sure she had turned off would be on when she woke up in the morning. The most chilling discovery was her basement door. Laura never used the basement, so she kept the door locked. But several times she came home to find the door unlocked, even though she kept the key in her coat pocket. Each time it happened, her heart raced with fear. At this point, Laura began to feel a growing sense of dread. Something was wrong. Very wrong. But no matter how hard she tried to explain it, she couldn't rationalize the strange occurrences. The unease grew stronger each day, but Laura felt helpless. Grace was still sitting on her porch every day, watching, her expression never changing, her eyes never leaving Laura's house. Then, one night, Laura's worst fears came true. She had gone to bed early after an exhausting day at work. The neighborhood was as silent as always, the only sound being the occasional rustle of leaves outside. Laura drifted off to sleep, but was woken up abruptly in the middle of the night by a strange noise. It sounded like rustling, but it was louder and more deliberate. Laura's eyes snapped open, and she lay there in the darkness, her heart pounding. The sound was coming from outside. Laura hesitated for a moment, her mind racing. Maybe it was an animal or the wind, but the rustling didn't stop. It sounded like footsteps. Gathering her courage, Laura climbed out of bed and tiptoed to her bedroom window. She carefully peeked through the curtain, and what she saw sent a shiver down her spine. Grace was outside, but she wasn't on her porch. She was crouched down by Laura's basement window, peering inside. Her hands were pressed against the glass, and her face was just inches from the window. Even from a distance, Laura could see Grace's lips moving rapidly, as if she was muttering something under her breath. Laura's heart raced. What was Grace doing? Why was she looking into her basement in the middle of the night? Was she trying to break in? Without thinking, Laura rushed outside. She had enough. This had gone too far. Grace, Laura shouted as she ran toward her. "What are you doing?" Grace didn't move. She remained crouched by the window, her face pressed against the glass, her lips still moving in that eerie whisper. Grace, Laura called again, louder this time. "What the hell are you doing on my property?" Slowly, Grace stood up. She turned to face Laura, her eyes wide and unblinking. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. She just stood there, staring at Laura with that same cold, emotionless expression. Then finally, Grace spoke. "They're waiting," she said, her voice hoarse and barely audible. Laura blinked, confused. "What? Who's waiting?" Grace's eyes flickered with something fear. Anger. Laura couldn't tell. Her lips twisted into a strange smile, and she took a step toward Laura. "They're waiting for you," Grace whispered again. Laura's blood ran cold. She stumbled back, her mind racing. What was Grace talking about? Who was they? What did she mean? Before Laura could say anything else, Grace turned and walked back to her house without another word. Laura stood there, frozen in place, watching as Grace disappeared into the darkness of her home. Shaken, Laura returned to her house and locked every door and window. She stayed up the rest of the night, her mind spinning with fear and confusion. Something was seriously wrong with Grace, but Laura didn't know what to do. Was Grace dangerous? Should she call the police? But what would she even tell them? The next few days passed uneventfully. Laura didn't see Grace, and for the first time in weeks, she started to feel a bit safer. Maybe confronting Grace had worked. Maybe Grace would leave her alone now. But that peace didn't last. One evening, about a week later, Laura came home from work to find something deeply unsettling. The basement door, which she always kept locked, was wide open. A sense of dread washed over her as she stood there, staring at the door. How had it opened? Had someone broken in? Or was it something else? Laura grabbed a flashlight and slowly made her way down the basement stairs. The air was cold and musty, and every step felt heavier than the last. As she reached the bottom, she shined her light across the floor, and what she saw made her stomach drop. There, scattered across the concrete floor, were all the items that had gone missing over the past few weeks. Her coffee mug, her hairbrush, her grandmother's old kitchen knife, they were all there, lying in a pile in the middle of the room. Laura's hands shook as she stared at the objects. How had they ended up here? Who had brought them into her basement? And why? Suddenly she heard a creak from above. Someone was in the house. Her heart raced as she bolted up the stairs, flashlight in hand. When she reached the top, she saw her. Grace was standing in the middle of Laura's living room, her back to Laura. She was muttering something under her breath, the same eerie chant Laura had heard her whispering outside. "Grace," Laura shouted, her voice shaking. "What the hell are you doing in my house?" Grace didn't move. She just kept muttering, her voice low and rhythmic. "Get out," Laura screamed, her fear turning to anger. "Get out of my house." Grace slowly turned around. Laura gasped in horror. Blood covered Grace's hands and arms. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking, and her lips were curled into a twisted smile. "You can't stop them," Grace whispered. "They're already here." Laura screamed and ran out of the house, dialing 911 as she fled into the street. The police arrived within minutes, and arrested Grace without a struggle. But the real horror came when the officers searched Grace's house. In the basement, they found the decomposing bodies of 2 women and a child, posed on a couch as if they were sleeping. The victims were Grace, a sister, and her 2 nieces. They had been dead for months, their bodies left to rot in the basement. Grace had been living with their corpses, and even more horrifying, she had taken photos with the bodies as they decayed. The police also found dozens of photographs of Laura taken through her windows over the past several weeks. Grace had been stalking her, watching her every move, and the officers believed that Laura had been Grace's next target. Laura moved out of the house the next day. She never looked back. Thank you for listening to this chilling story. Have you ever experienced something strange with your neighbor? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more terrifying tales, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Your support helps us bring you more spine-tingling content. Stay safe, and always be aware of who's watching. David had been through a lot over the past year. He had recently gone through a tough divorce and needed a fresh start. That's when he found a loft in the heart of downtown. It wasn't fancy, but it had charmed tall windows, exposed brick walls, and an open floor plan. The best part was that it was located in a quiet building with only a few units. It was just what David needed to pick up the pieces of his life and move on. The day he moved in, everything seemed perfect. The city buzzed below his window, but inside his apartment, there was a calmness. He could finally relax. As he unpacked, he noticed his neighbor from upstairs, a man in his 30s carrying large, heavy trunks up to his apartment unit 6 billion. He was doing this alone, with no help, even though the trunks seemed heavy enough to require at least 2 people to carry. The neighbor was dressed oddly. He wore a full suit, despite the heat that day. David figured the guy was just a bit eccentric, but shrugged it off. Over the next few weeks, David noticed that the man from 6 billion had some strange habits. He rarely left his apartment, but when he did, it was always late at night or very early in the morning, often lugging more large, heavy items. One night, around 3 a.m., David woke up to the sound of loud banging coming from the floor above. He tried to go back to sleep, but the noise continued dull thuds, as if something very large was being dragged across the floor. After about an hour, the noises stopped, and silence returned. In the morning, David ran into the man from 6 billion on the stairs. The man smiled politely and nodded as they passed each other, but David couldn't shake the odd feeling he got from him. The man didn't seem dangerous, but something was off. David thought about asking him about the noises, but decided against it. He didn't want to seem nosy or start off on the wrong foot with his new neighbor. Then, things got stranger. About a month after moving in, David began to notice odd smells coming from the apartment above. The smells were hard to describe, like a mix of chemicals and something decaying. At first, David thought it might be food gone bad, or maybe the guy upstairs was cleaning with strong products. But the smells persisted, lingering in the hallways, and sometimes even seeping into David's apartment. One evening, David decided to confront the man about the smells. He had been planning to ask casually, perhaps make a joke about strange cooking. But when he reached the door to 6 billion, something stopped him. He felt a wave of anxiety wash over him. His hand hovered over the door, ready to knock, but his gut told him to walk away. Without fully understanding why, he turned around and went back to his apartment, deciding not to confront the man after all. That night, the banging noises returned. This time they were louder, more frequent. It sounded like furniture being thrown across the floor, or perhaps large objects being moved around. David lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening as the strange noises continued for hours. There were occasional pauses, followed by more thudding. At one point, David thought he heard what sounded like a faint scream, but the noise was quickly drowned out by more banging. His heart raced, but he convinced himself it was nothing. Maybe the man was rearranging furniture in the middle of the night. Maybe he had some late-night project. But deep down, David knew something wasn't right. The next morning, David ran into one of the other tenants in the building, an elderly woman named Mrs. Jenkins. She had lived in the building for over 20 years and seemed to know everyone. David struck up a conversation with her, hoping to learn more about the man in 6 billion. "Oh, him," Mrs. Jenkins said, lowering her voice. "He's been here for about a year. Quiet fellow. Keeps to himself. But I'll tell you, there's something strange about him. I've heard those noises too late at night. I've complained to the landlord, but nothing ever comes of it." David pressed for more information, but Mrs. Jenkins shook her head. "Nobody knows much about him. He never talks to anyone. Comes and goes at odd hours, never has visitors. I've never even seen him with groceries." The conversation only deepened David's unease. Who was this man? Why did he seem to live such an isolated, secretive life? And what was causing those strange smells and noises? That night, David found himself lying awake again, listening to the familiar thudding sounds from upstairs. The noises were louder this time, more violent. His curiosity finally got the better of him. Grabbing a flashlight, he tiptoed up the stairs to the 6th floor, intending to find out what was going on. As he reached the door to 6 billion, he heard the noises clearly through the walls, loud banging, scraping sounds, and something else, a low, muffled voice. David's heart pounded in his chest. He pressed his ear against the door, straining to hear. Suddenly, the noises stopped. David stood frozen in place, his breath catching in his throat. Silence filled the hallway. After a few moments, he heard footsteps approaching the door from the other side. Panic surged through him. He didn't know why, but he felt an overwhelming urge to run. Without thinking, he turned and bolted down the stairs, his heart racing, the sound of the footsteps still echoing in his ears. Back in his apartment, David locked the door and leaned against it, trying to catch his breath. What had he been thinking? What would he have done if the man had opened the door? He didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, David woke to the smell of something burning. The acrid odor of smoke filled his apartment, seeping through the walls. He jumped out of bed and rushed into the hallway, his heart pounding. The smell was coming from upstairs from 6 billion. David's first thought was that there was a fire, but there were no alarms, no smoke filling the hallway. He hesitated for a moment, then ran up the stairs to check on the man in 6 billion. When he reached the door, the smell of burning was almost unbearable, but there was no smoke, no sign of fire. David knocked on the door, unsure of what he would say if the man answered. To his surprise, the door swung open. David stood frozen, staring into the apartment. The man from 6 billion was standing in the doorway, wearing the same suit he always wore, his face calm and composed. Behind him, the apartment was dark, the windows covered with heavy curtains. The smell of burning was even stronger inside. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice steady but cold. David struggled to find his words. I thought I smelled something burning." "Are you okay?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Everything's fine," he said. "I was just cooking." David glanced past him into the apartment, but he couldn't see much in the dim light. The smell of burning was still overpowering, but the man didn't seem concerned. David opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, the man stepped forward, closing the door behind him. "I appreciate your concern," the man said, his voice even colder now. "But there's nothing to worry about." David nodded, his mind racing. The man stood there for a moment, staring at him with that same unnerving smile, then turned and walked back into his apartment, shutting the door. For the rest of the day, David couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong in that apartment. The smells, the noises, the man's strange behavior, it all added up to something sinister. But what? What was going on in 6 billion? Later that evening, David was in his kitchen when he heard the loud thud from above again. This time, it was louder than ever, as though something heavy had been dropped onto the floor. The ceiling shook, and dust fell from the corners. David jumped at the sound, his heart racing. Then he heard something that made his blood run cold. The scream, faint, but unmistakable. David froze, his mind racing. He wasn't imagining it this time. He had heard it, someone had screamed. Without thinking, he grabbed his phone and dialed 911. "There's something going on in the apartment above me," David told the dispatcher, his voice shaking. "I think someone's in trouble." I heard screaming. The dispatcher asked for details, and David explained everything: the strange noises, the smells, the scream. The dispatcher told him to stay in his apartment and wait for the police to arrive. Minutes felt like hours as David waited, his mind racing. He paced back and forth, his ears straining to hear any more sounds from upstairs. But there was nothing, only silence. Finally, the police arrived. David met them at the entrance to the building and led them upstairs to 6 billion. The officers knocked on the door, but there was no answer. After a few minutes, they decided to enter the apartment. David watched from the hallway as the officers went inside. The door swung open, and the smell of decay and chemicals hit him like a wave. He covered his mouth and nose, trying to block out the stench. Inside, the apartment was a mess. Piles of junk cluttered the floor, and strange machines lined the walls, humming quietly. But there was no sign of the man from 6 billion. Then, the officers found it. In the corner of the living room, behind a pile of furniture, was a large, metal trunk. The officers forced it open, and inside they found something that made David's stomach turn. A body. The man in 6 billion had been hiding something, or someone, in that trunk. The officers couldn't determine how long the body had been there, but it was clear that this was what had been causing the terrible smells and strange noises. As the police searched the apartment further, they discovered more disturbing evidence: photographs, diaries, and strange symbols drawn on the walls. It was clear that the man in 6 billion had been involved in something dark, something that had led to someone's death. But the man himself was gone. David was questioned by the police, but there were no answers to the biggest question: where had the man in 6 billion gone? And what had he been doing in that apartment all those nights? The police searched the building and the surrounding area, but they never found him. It was as if he had disappeared without a trace. David moved out of the building the following week, unable to stay in a place that had become the center of such a horrifying mystery. But even after he left, he couldn't shake the feeling that the man in 6 billion was still out there, watching, waiting. It had been a whirlwind few months for Sam. He had recently moved to a new town, took up a new job, and was still adjusting to life in a neighborhood that seemed quieter than he was used to. The house he rented was located in a small, sleepy town, the type where everyone knew everyone. The rent was affordable, the streets were tree-lined and pleasant, and his new home had the right mix of charm and space. To Sam, it seemed like the perfect escape from the fast-paced city life he was leaving behind. The first week was uneventful. Sam spent his time unpacking boxes, hanging pictures on the walls, and exploring the small town. His neighbors were friendly, but kept to themselves, which suited Sam just fine. He wasn't looking to make friends or become overly involved in the community. He just wanted peace and quiet. However, on the 10th day after he had moved in, Sam's peaceful life was interrupted by something strange. It was just past 3 a.m. when he was woken up by an odd sound outside. He lay in bed, trying to place the noise. It was rhythmic and faint at first, almost like footsteps. But as it grew louder, he realized it wasn't footsteps at all. It was the sound of someone snapping their fingers. Snap, snap, snap. Sam frowned and sat up in bed, his heart beating a little faster. Who would be outside snapping their fingers at this time of night? He got out of bed, quietly moved to the window, and peeked through the blinds. At first, he saw nothing, just the dark, empty street. But then he spotted a figure in the distance. There was a man walking slowly down the street, his head down, and his fingers snapping in perfect rhythm. He was dressed in an old-fashioned suit and hat, something that seemed out of place in this sleepy little town. The snapping continued, precise and methodical, like the ticking of a clock. Sam watched, transfixed, as the man made his way past his house. The figure never looked up, never paused, just kept snapping those fingers as he walked. When the man disappeared down the street, the snapping grew fainter until it was completely gone, leaving Sam in an eerie, unsettling silence. He stood by the window for a few more minutes, waiting to see if the man would come back. When he didn't, Sam shook his head and crawled back into bed. Just a weird local, he muttered to himself. Probably just harmless. But deep down, he couldn't shake the strange feeling that the man had brought with him. It lingered in the air like a bad dream. The next morning, Sam's curiosity got the better of him. He decided to ask his neighbors if they had seen anything strange the night before. His nearest neighbor was an older woman named Mrs. Klein, who lived in the house directly across from his. Sam had spoken to her only once before, when she had come by to introduce herself and bring him a welcome basket of cookies. He knocked on her door, and a few moments later, Mrs. Klein answered, her expression as warm as always. "Good morning, Mrs. Klein," Sam said. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I just wanted to ask, did you hear anything strange last night? Around 3 a.m. Her smile faded slightly, and a shadow passed over her face. "You heard him, didn't you?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. Sam blinked in confusion. "Heard who?" "The snapping man," she said, glancing nervously around as if to make sure no one else was listening. "He comes every night at 3 a.m. Sharp. I've lived here for 40 years, and he's always been here. Always snapping. Always walking." Sam frowned. "Who is he?" "No one knows," Mrs. Klein said quietly. "And you don't want to know. All I can tell you is that he's not normal. He only comes out at 3 a.m. and walks down the street, snapping his fingers. He doesn't look at anyone. He doesn't say anything. He just snaps." Sam felt a chill run down his spine. "Has anyone ever tried to talk to him?" Mrs. Klein shook her head violently. "Oh no, you mustn't try to talk to him. And never, ever look at him directly." "Why not?" Mrs. Klein hesitated, her hands trembling slightly. "There are stories. People who tried to interact with him. They didn't last long afterward. People say that if you make eye contact with him, something bad will happen. No one knows what, but those who've tried aren't here to tell the tale. They disappear." Sam laughed nervously, though he didn't feel amused. "Come on, that sounds like an urban legend. He's probably just some weirdo who likes to walk at night." Mrs. Klein's expression remained serious. "You'll see. Just don't look at him. Promise me." Sam nodded, more out of politeness than belief. "Okay, I won't look at him." That night, Sam found it hard to fall asleep. Mrs. Klein's warning echoed in his mind. Who was the snapping man? Was it just a local legend to scare newcomers, or was there something more to it? By the time 3 a.m. rolled around, Sam was wide awake, lying in bed, waiting. At exactly 3:01, he heard the unmistakable sound of fingers snapping outside his window. Snap. 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 His heart raced, and despite Mrs. Klein's warning, he felt a powerful urge to look. He knew he shouldn't, but the curiosity gnawed at him. What harm could it do? After all, he didn't believe in superstitions. He was a rational person. Sam slipped out of bed and walked to the window. He pulled the curtain aside, just enough to get a glimpse of the street. There he was, the snapping man. Just like the night before, he was walking down the street, his head down, snapping his fingers rhythmically as he passed each house. Sam's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the man approach his house. Suddenly, the man stopped. Sam froze, his breath catching in his throat. The snapping man stood perfectly still in the middle of the street, his fingers suspended in mid-snap. Slowly, he raised his head, as if sensing that someone was watching him. Sam's hand tightened on the curtain. He knew he shouldn't look at him directly, but he couldn't help it. The snapping man lifted his face, and for the first time, Sam saw him clearly. His eyes. They were black, completely black. No whites, no pupils, just deep, endless voids that seemed to suck in all the light around them. Sam gasped, stumbling backward. He quickly let the curtain fall back into place, his heart hammering in his chest. What had he just seen? The man's eyes, they were unnatural. No human had eyes like that. Sam stood frozen in place for what felt like an eternity, listening. Outside, the snapping continued, slow and deliberate. Snap, snap. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the snapping faded into the distance, and the street was silent once again. Sam didn't sleep that night. He stayed up, his mind racing, replaying the events over and over. Who was the snapping man? And what had he seen in those black, soulless eyes? The next morning, Sam decided to visit Mrs. Klein again. He needed answers. He needed to understand what had just happened. But when he knocked on her door, there was no answer. Sam frowned and knocked again, but still no response. He glanced through the window and saw that the house was dark, the curtains drawn. He called out her name, but there was nothing, just silence. Feeling uneasy, Sam walked back to his house. Maybe she wasn't home, or maybe she didn't want to talk. But as the day wore on, the feeling of unease only grew stronger. That night, as 3 a.m. approached, Sam found himself staring at the clock, waiting. He told himself he wouldn't look this time. He would follow Mrs. Klein's advice and stay in bed. But when the snapping began, he couldn't resist. The sound was slower this time, more deliberate. Snap, snap. Each snap seemed to echo through the quiet house, louder than before. Sam sat up in bed, his heart pounding. He had to look. He had to know if the snapping man would stop again, if he would sense Sam watching him. This time, Sam didn't bother with the curtain. He stood at the window and pulled it wide open. The snapping man was already there, standing directly in front of Sam's house, his head down, his fingers snapping in perfect rhythm. Sam's breath caught in his throat. Slowly, the snapping man lifted his head, his black eyes locking onto Sam's. For a long moment, they stared at each other, neither moving. Then, the snapping man smiled. It was a smile that sent a chill down Sam's spine, a cold, unnatural smile that didn't belong on a human face. Without thinking, Sam slammed the window shut and backed away, his heart racing. He felt sick, his skin crawling with fear. He had made eye contact with the snapping man. What had he done? The snapping continued outside, growing faster, more erratic. Snap, snap, snap. Sam stumbled backward, his mind racing. He had to get out of there. He had to leave. But before he could move, there was a loud bang on his front door. Sam froze. His breath came in short, shallow gasps as he stared at the door, his heart pounding in his ears. The banging came again, louder this time. It was followed by the sound of snapping fingers right outside the door. Sam backed away slowly, his mind spinning. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. The banging continued, followed by a soft, rhythmic snapping. Sam pressed himself against the wall, his pulse racing. He couldn't open the door. He couldn't let him in. Then, suddenly, the snapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Sam stood frozen in place, listening, waiting. After a long moment, he cautiously crept toward the door. He pressed his ear against it, straining to hear any sound, but there was nothing, just silence. Slowly, Sam reached for the doorknob. His hand trembled as he turned it, pulling the door open just a crack. There was no one there. Sam stepped out onto the porch, looking around. The street was empty. The snapping man was gone. But as Sam stood there, trying to catch his breath, he heard it again. Snap, snap, snap. The sound was coming from behind him. Sam whirled around, his heart hammering in his chest. The snapping man was standing right behind him, his black eyes fixed on Sam, his fingers snapping in perfect rhythm. Sam screamed and stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet as he scrambled to get away. The snapping man took a step forward, his snapping growing louder, faster. Desperate, Sam ran back into the house and slammed the door shut. He locked it and backed away, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The snapping continued outside, faster and faster, until it seemed to echo through the entire house. Then, suddenly, it stopped. Sam stood frozen in place, his heart pounding in his chest. The silence was unbearable. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, Sam crept toward the window. He peeked outside, but the street was empty. The snapping man was gone. But Sam knew he would be back. He always came back. Thank you for joining us for this chilling story. Have you ever experienced anything as creepy as the snapping man? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tap the notification bell so you never miss a new horror story. Your support helps us keep creating spine-tingling tales just like this one. Stay safe, and beware of what lurks outside at 3A.M. When Amanda first moved into her new house, she was thrilled. It was a beautiful two-story home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, surrounded by large oak trees and well-manicured lawns. It was the perfect place to start her new life after moving across the country for work. The neighborhood seemed ideal, clean, quiet, and friendly. But there was one house that immediately stood out from the rest. It was the house directly across the street, a dark, brooding place that looked like it had seen better days. The lawn was overgrown, the windows were often covered with mismatched curtains, and the paint on the exterior was peeling. The house seemed out of place in the otherwise pristine neighborhood. The day Amanda moved in, a family of 4 emerged from that house. They stood in the driveway, watching as Amanda and the movers carried furniture into her new home. There was a tall, heavy-set man with a scruffy beard, a thin, disheveled woman, and 2 small children, a boy and a girl, both around 8 or 9 years old. Amanda tried to be friendly. She waved at them, smiling as she did so. The children waved back, but the adults didn't. The man simply nodded slightly and turned away, while the woman stood there, her expression unreadable. Something about the way they observed her from across the street made Amanda feel uneasy. It wasn't just curiosity, it was something else. Still, she brushed it off. It was a new neighborhood, and people were probably just trying to get a sense of who the new arrival was. She was sure they were nice people, just a little shy. For the first few weeks, Amanda kept to herself, busy with work and settling into her new home. She would occasionally see the family across the street, but they never interacted much. The kids would play in the yard, and the man would sometimes stand outside smoking a cigarette, his eyes scanning the street. He always looked tense, as if waiting for something. The woman Amanda never learned her name was a shadow of a person. She rarely left the house, and when she did, she moved quickly, her eyes darting around as if she was afraid someone was watching her. On the rare occasion Amanda saw her outside, the woman would avoid eye contact, hurrying back inside as soon as possible. It was strange, Amanda thought, how isolated the family seemed. The other neighbors didn't seem to interact with them either. When Amanda mentioned the family in passing to her next-door neighbor, Mrs. Walker, the older woman just sighed and shook her head. "I don't know much about them," Mrs. Walker said. "They keep to themselves. The kids go to school, and that man works, but there's been trouble over the years. Police have come a few times. I try not to get involved." This piqued Amanda's curiosity. Trouble? What kind of trouble? She wanted to ask more, but Mrs. Walker seemed reluctant to continue the conversation. The mystery of the family across the street continued to gnaw at Amanda over the following months. Every now and then, she'd notice strange things. There were often loud arguments coming from the house late at night, shouting, thudding, the sounds of furniture being knocked over. Once or twice, Amanda saw the man leaving the house in the middle of the night, always returning hours later. Each time, his face was pale and strained, his hands trembling as he fumbled for his keys. One evening, as Amanda was sitting on her porch, sipping tea and enjoying the cool night air, she heard something that made her freeze. A scream. It was high-pitched and desperate, coming from across the street. She stood up, her heart pounding in her chest, and listened. There was again another scream, followed by the sound of something crashing. Without thinking, Amanda grabbed her phone and dialed 911. She reported the screams, telling the dispatcher that she wasn't sure what was going on, but that something sounded terribly wrong. The police arrived a few minutes later, and Amanda watched from her window as they knocked on the door of the house across the street. The man answered the door, looking tired and annoyed. He spoke with the officers for a few minutes, and then they left. Amanda watched in disbelief as the police drove away, leaving the family to return to whatever it was they had been doing. The next morning, Amanda saw the woman outside, standing on the porch. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, and her face was pale and bruised. Amanda felt a wave of sympathy for her. Clearly something was wrong in that house, but no one seemed to be doing anything about it. Over the next few weeks, things quieted down. The arguments seemed to stop, and Amanda didn't see the man leaving at odd hours anymore. She thought maybe things had improved, maybe the family was getting help. But then one night, something happened that Amanda would never forget. It was around midnight, and Amanda was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep. The house was silent, and she was just about to drift off when she heard a noise outside. At first she thought it was just the wind, but then she heard it again, a soft, rhythmic tapping sound, like someone knocking on a door. She sat up in bed, listening intently. The tapping continued, and it seemed to be coming from outside her window. Her heart raced as she got out of bed and walked over to the window. She pulled the curtain aside, and what she saw made her stomach drop. The little boy from across the street was standing in her yard, his eyes wide with fear. He was barefoot, and his clothes were dirty and torn. He was tapping on her window with his small hand, his expression pleading. Amanda quickly opened the window. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please," the boy said, his voice trembling. "Help me, my mom. She's in trouble." Amanda didn't hesitate. She grabbed her phone and ran outside, her heart pounding in her chest. The boy led her across the street to his house, and as they approached the front door, Amanda could hear muffled voices coming from inside, angry voices. The man was shouting, and the woman was crying. The boy opened the door and pulled Amanda inside. The living room was dimly lit, and the air was thick with tension. The man was standing in the middle of the room, his face red with anger, while the woman cowered in the corner, her face streaked with tears. "Get out of here," the man growled, his eyes narrowing as he saw Amanda. "This is none of your business." Amanda's heart raced. She could feel the danger in the air, the tension so thick it was suffocating. But she couldn't leave, not with the boy and his mother in danger. "I'm calling the police," Amanda said, holding up her phone. "You need to stop this." The man's face twisted into a sneer. "Go ahead," he spat. "Call them. They won't do anything. They never do." Amanda hesitated, her finger hovering over the call button. The man was right, the police had been to the house before, and nothing had changed. But she couldn't just stand by and do nothing. Before she could make the call, the woman suddenly stood up, her voice shaky but determined. "You need to leave," she said, her eyes locked on Amanda. "Please, this isn't your fight." Amanda opened her mouth to protest, but the woman shook her head. "Go," she whispered. "I'll be fine." Reluctantly, Amanda turned and left the house, the boy's fearful eyes following her as she walked back across the street. She didn't sleep that night. She sat by the window watching the house, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The next morning, the family was gone. Amanda stared in disbelief at the empty house. The overgrown lawn and peeling paint were still there, but the family had disappeared. The curtains were drawn, the windows dark. There was no sign of the man, the woman, or the children. For days, Amanda waited for them to return. She kept an eye on the house, hoping to see some sign of life, but the house remained empty. She asked around the neighborhood, but no one seemed to know what had happened to the family. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. Weeks passed, and eventually a new family moved into the house. A nice couple with a baby, who seemed completely unaware of the history of the home they now lived in. Amanda never told them about the family of 4. She wasn't sure they would believe her if she did. But Amanda never forgot. She couldn't forget the little boy's terrified face, or the woman's bruised and tear-streaked expression. And she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened in that house. Years later, Amanda still lives in the same house. She's built a life for herself, made friends in the neighborhood, and settled into a routine. But every now and then, when the wind blows just right, she thinks she hears a faint tapping at her window, and she remembers the family that disappeared without a trace. She's never quite shaken the feeling that they're still out there somewhere, and every time she passes the house across the street, she feels a chill run down her spine, as if the walls are holding on to the secrets of what really happened to the family of 4. When Kyle first moved into the old brick apartment building, He was excited to start his new job and enjoy the city life. The place was small but affordable, and the neighborhood was quiet, exactly what he was looking for. Kyle's apartment was on the third floor, and most of the tenants were older, longtime residents who seemed to keep to themselves. Kyle's next-door neighbor, however, immediately caught his attention. Mr. Rourke lived in the apartment directly across the hall from Kyle. He was a grizzled man in his late 60s, with a face deeply lined by time and experience. He had the look of someone who had seen more than his share of the world's horrors, a man who had lived through things most people would never understand. From the moment Kyle moved in, Mr. Rourke's presence was felt. He was a Vietnam veteran, a fact that was clear from the various stickers and signs on his door: Vietnam vet, proud and strong, Purple Heart recipient, and don't tread on ME. Kyle wasn't one to pry into other people's lives, but he quickly learned from other tenants that Mr. Rourke had been in the war and suffered from severe post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. The old man kept mostly to himself, but when he was around, the atmosphere seemed to change. He had an air of tension about him, like a coiled spring ready to snap at any moment. Kyle would see Mr. Rourke in passing, a brief nod in the hallway or on the stairs, but they never really spoke. However, it wasn't long before Kyle started hearing strange things coming from the old man's apartment at night. It started with noises, low muttering, the sound of furniture scraping against the floor, heavy footsteps pacing back and forth across the room. Kyle tried to ignore it, assuming it was just the man going about his late-night routine, but the sounds soon escalated. One night, just as Kyle was about to fall asleep, he was jolted awake by a loud bang from the apartment next door. It sounded like something heavy had been thrown against the wall. Then came the shouting. Kyle couldn't make out the words, but the voice was unmistakably Mr. Rourke's, angry, panicked, and distressed. Kyle sat up in bed, his heart pounding. The shouting continued, rising and falling in intensity. It was clear that Mr. Rourke was having some kind of episode, possibly a nightmare. Kyle had read about PTSD and knew that veterans often experience flashbacks to their time in combat, but this was the first time he had witnessed something like this firsthand. He debated what to do. Should he go over and check on him? Call the building manager? But before he could make a decision, the shouting stopped as suddenly as it had started. The apartment fell silent. Kyle lay in bed for a long time, his mind racing. He felt a deep sense of unease. He had known that Mr. Rourke was a vet with PTSD, but hearing the man in such obvious distress made it all the more real. He wondered what Mr. Rourke had seen during the war, what memories haunted him to this day. The next morning, Kyle bumped into one of the other tenants, a middle-aged woman named Carol who had lived in the building for years. She seemed to know everything about everyone, and Kyle figured she might have some insight into what was going on with Mr. Rourke. Cry. He's been through a lot, Carol said when Kyle mentioned the noises. He doesn't talk about it much, but from what I've heard, he saw some terrible things in Vietnam. Most of the time, he's quiet, but every now and then he has these episodes. What kind of episodes? Kyle asked, though he already had a pretty good idea. Carol glanced around as if to make sure no one else was listening. He gets these flashbacks, I guess. He's had them for years. Sometimes in the middle of the night, he'll start yelling like he's back in the war. It scares the hell out of everyone in the building, but there's not much anyone can do. He doesn't have any family left, and he refuses to get help. Kyle nodded, feeling a pang of sympathy for the old man. He couldn't imagine what it must be like to live with those kinds of memories, to be haunted by the past every single day. Over the next few weeks, Kyle tried to keep his distance from Mr. Rourke. He didn't want to intrude, and he wasn't sure how to approach the man without bringing up painful memories. But the noises continued, and the shouting became more frequent. Every night, like clockwork, the sounds of distress would echo through the walls, keeping Kyle awake and on edge. One evening, as Kyle was coming home from work, he saw Mr. Rourke sitting on the steps outside the building, smoking a cigarette. The man looked even more haggard than usual, his eyes bloodshot, his hands trembling slightly as he held the cigarette. Kyle hesitated for a moment, then decided to approach him. "Good evening, Mr. Rourke," Kyle said, trying to sound casual. Mr. Rourke glanced up at him, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Evening," he muttered, taking another drag of his cigarette. Kyle shifted awkwardly, unsure of how to start the conversation. I've heard you having some rough nights lately, he said finally. Are you okay? Mr. Rourke didn't answer right away. He stared at the ground, his jaw clenched, as if he was weighing his words carefully. Been through worse, he said after a long pause. His voice was low and gravelly, worn down by years of smoking, and Kyle suspected years of shouting. Kyle nodded, not knowing what else to say. He didn't want to pry, but he felt like he should offer something. If you ever need anything, someone to talk to. I'm just across the hall. Mr. Rourke snorted, but it wasn't a sound of amusement. Don't need anyone to talk to, he said, his voice tinged with bitterness. Talking doesn't change anything, doesn't stop the dreams. Kyle felt a chill run down his spine. He had expected the man to be distant, but there was something about his tone, the way he spoke, that unsettled him. Well, the offer's there, Kyle said, trying to sound reassuring. Just in case. Mr. Rourke didn't respond. He finished his cigarette in silence, then stood up and walked back into the building without another word. For the next few nights, the shouting from Mr. Rourke's apartment grew worse. It wasn't just the occasional outburst anymore, it was full-blown arguments, as if he was reliving some long-ago battle. Kyle could hear the man yelling orders, shouting for someone to take cover, screaming in pain. It was terrifying, and it left Kyle feeling helpless. He knew the man needed help, but he also knew Mr. Rourke would never ask for it. One night, Kyle was woken up by a particularly loud crash from next door. It sounded like furniture being overturned, followed by frantic shouting. Kyle sat up in bed, his heart racing. He knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. He quickly got dressed and went over to Mr. Rourke's door. He knocked, but there was no answer. The shouting from inside continued, growing more frantic by the second. Mr. Rourke, Kyle called, pounding on the door. Are you okay in there? Still no response, just more shouting. Kyle hesitated, then tried the doorknob. To his surprise, the door wasn't locked. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The apartment was a mess. Furniture had been overturned, and papers were scattered everywhere. Mr. Rourke was standing in the middle of the room, his back to Kyle, his body tense and rigid. He was shouting at something or someone that wasn't there. I told you to take cover, he screamed, his voice hoarse and desperate. Why didn't you listen? Kyle's heart broke as he watched the old man relive some horrible memory from the war. He didn't know what to do. He didn't want to startle Mr. Rourke, but he couldn't just leave him like this. Mr. Rourke, Kyle said gently, stepping closer. It's okay, you're safe, you're home. The old man didn't seem to hear him. He was still lost in his own world, shouting at invisible enemies, his fists clenched at his sides. Kyle took a deep breath and reached out, gently touching Mr. Rourke's shoulder. Hey, it's okay, he said softly. You're not in the war anymore. You're home. You're safe. For a moment, it seemed like Mr. Rourke didn't even register Kyle's presence. But then, slowly, the old man's shoulders slumped, and the shouting stopped. He stood there, breathing heavily, his whole body trembling. Kyle gently guided him to the couch and sat him down. Mr. Rourke's eyes were glassy, unfocused, as if he was still somewhere else, trapped in the past. After a long silence, the old man finally spoke. They never listen, he whispered, his voice thick, with emotion. No matter how many times I tell them, they never listen. Kyle sat beside him, unsure of what to say. He didn't know the details of Mr. Rourke's past, but he could see the weight of it in the man's eyes. The pain, the guilt, it was all there, etched into his face like a permanent scar. They never made it out, Mr. Rourke continued, his voice cracking. I told them to take cover, but they didn't listen. They were just kids. Kyle swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in his throat. He had read about the horrors of Vietnam, but hearing it firsthand was something entirely different. He couldn't imagine what it must have been like to carry that kind of guilt for so many years. I'm sorry, Kyle said softly, though he knew his words wouldn't change anything. I'm so sorry. Mr. Rourke didn't respond. He just stared at the floor, his hands trembling in his lap. After a while, Kyle gently suggested that Mr. Rourke try to get some rest. The old man nodded numbly and shuffled off to his bedroom without another word. For the next few weeks, Kyle checked in on Mr. Rourke regularly. The old man was reluctant to accept help at first, but over time he seemed to grow more comfortable with Kyle's presence. The episodes continued, but they seemed less frequent than Mr. Rourke slowly began to open up about his experiences in the war. He told Kyle about the battles, the friends he had lost, the mistakes he had made. There were nights when the memories were too much, when Mr. Rourke would break down in tears, his body racked with sobs as he relived the horrors of Vietnam. Kyle would sit with him, offering what little comfort he could. It wasn't much, but it was something. One evening, after a particularly bad episode, Mr. Rourke looked at Kyle and said something that stuck with him for a long time. "You can survive a war," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But that doesn't mean you ever really leave it behind." Kyle nodded, not knowing what to say. Mr. Rourke passed away a few months later, peacefully in his sleep. The building was quiet after that, but the memory of the old man stayed with Kyle. He had learned more from Mr. Rourke than he ever could have imagined about pain, about survival, and about the scars that never fully heal. To this day, Kyle still thinks about Mr. Rourke and the burden he carried. He hopes that, wherever the old man is now, he has finally found the peace that eluded him in life. After a long search, Jenny had finally found an apartment she could afford. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small unit in an older building with thin walls and creaky floors. But the price was right, and the location was perfect. The building was old but charming, with its vintage brick exterior and wooden staircases that groaned with age. The apartment itself was on the second floor of a 3-story building. The ceiling was high, the windows were large, and Jenny could imagine herself creating a cozy little haven there. The first few days were a whirlwind of unpacking, getting furniture delivered, and figuring out the best places to shop in the neighborhood. The residents were quiet and kept to themselves, which suited her just fine. The only odd thing was that the apartment above hers, Unit 3 billion, seemed to be vacant. Jenny had asked the building manager about it when she signed the lease, and he had been vague, just saying that the previous tenants had moved out a while ago, and the apartment was in the process of being rented again. Jenny had hoped for some quiet time before new tenants moved in, but her hopes were dashed the very first night she spent in the apartment. As she lay in bed, trying to relax and unwind, she began to hear footsteps. They were faint at first, a slow, measured pacing that echoed faintly from above. It was the unmistakable sound of someone walking back and forth across the room. Jenny's first thought was that she must have misunderstood the building manager. Perhaps there were tenants in the apartment above after all. She listened for a while longer, but as the hours dragged on, the footsteps continued. Something about them felt off. They never stopped. Whoever was upstairs wasn't just walking around occasionally, they were pacing, back and forth, without end. The sound was rhythmic, unchanging. No pauses, no changes in direction, just an endless, steady pattern of footsteps. It was strange, but Jenny figured it was probably just the new neighbors settling in, maybe unpacking or organizing. She tried to ignore it and eventually fell asleep. But the next night, it happened again. Around 10 p.m., just as Jenny was getting ready for bed, the footsteps started. Slow, deliberate, almost methodical. Back and forth, back and forth. They continued for hours, keeping Jenny awake and growing more unsettling by the minute. She could imagine the floorboards creaking under the weight of invisible feet, the hollow sound of footsteps echoing in the empty apartment above. This went on for 3 nights straight. Every evening, the footsteps would start, always around the same time, and they wouldn't stop until the early hours of the morning. By the 4th night, Jenny was beyond frustrated. She hadn't seen or heard anyone move into the apartment, and there was no furniture being brought in, no sounds of life, no voices, just walking. Her curiosity got the better of her, and the next morning she decided to ask the building manager about the upstairs tenants. "Is someone living in Unit 3 billion now?" Jenny asked, trying to sound casual. The building manager, a middle-aged man named Greg, frowned and shook his head. "No, it's still vacant," he said. "I'm waiting to hear back from a couple of prospective tenants, but no one's moved in yet." Jenny blinked in surprise. "But I keep hearing footsteps up there at night. It sounds like someone's walking around." Greg's frown deepened. "That's not possible," he said firmly. "No one's been in that apartment for weeks, and the only time anyone goes in is when I show it to potential renters. You must be hearing things from another unit." Jenny wanted to argue, but she didn't. Greg's tone made it clear that the conversation was over. She left his office feeling more confused than ever. If no one was living in Unit 3 billion, then who or what was making those footsteps? That night, the footsteps started again. This time, Jenny was ready. She grabbed her keys and marched upstairs to the 3rd floor, determined to get to the bottom of it. When she reached the door to Unit 3 billion, she paused, listening. The footsteps were louder now, echoing through the thin walls. It was as if someone was pacing right behind the door. Her heart raced as she knocked. The footsteps stopped. Jenny waited, her pulse quickening in the silence that followed. She knocked again, louder this time, but there was no response. No footsteps, no movement, just silence. After a few moments, she reached for the doorknob. To her surprise, it turned easily in her hand. The door was unlocked. Slowly, cautiously, Jenny pushed the door open and stepped inside. The apartment was dark and completely empty. No furniture, no boxes, no signs of life. Dust covered the floor, undisturbed. She walked through the rooms, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. There was no one there. But just as she was about to leave, she heard it again. Footsteps soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. They were coming from the hallway behind her. Jenny froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. The hallway was empty. For a long moment, Jenny stood there, listening. The footsteps had stopped again, but the silence was somehow more terrifying than the sound itself. Feeling a wave of dread wash over her, she quickly left the apartment and locked the door behind her. Back in her own apartment, she sat on the couch, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was in that apartment, even though it was completely empty. The next day, Jenny decided to ask her neighbors if they had heard anything strange coming from Unit 3 billion. She knocked on the door of the apartment next to hers, where an elderly woman named Mrs. Delaney lived. Mrs. Delaney had been in the building for years and knew everything about everyone. "Excuse me," Mrs. Delaney. Jenny began hesitantly. "I was wondering if you've heard anything strange coming from the apartment above me. I keep hearing footsteps at night, but the building manager says no one's living there." Mrs. Delaney's face grew pale, and she glanced nervously at the ceiling before lowering her voice. "You've been hearing them too," she whispered. Jenny's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? You've heard the footsteps?" Mrs. Delaney nodded slowly. "For years. It started after the accident." "Accident?" Jenny echoed, confused. "What accident?" Mrs. Delaney hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "The family who lived there before it was a mother, father, and their teenage daughter. They seemed like a nice family at first, but then things changed. They started fighting all the time, and there were strange noises coming from their apartment at all hours. The daughter, she was troubled. She had been in and out of therapy for years. One night, after a particularly bad argument with her parents, Mrs. Delaney's voice trailed off, and she glanced at the floor, her expression pained. What?" Jenny prompted gently. "She jumped," Mrs. Delaney whispered, "from the window in her bedroom. She didn't survive." Jenny felt a chill run down her spine. "And after that, the parents moved away, and the apartment's been empty ever since," Mrs. Delaney said. "But the footsteps, they've never stopped. Some of the neighbors say it's her, the daughter, walking back and forth, just like she used to when she was alive." Jenny felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had heard of haunted houses, but she had never believed in ghosts, at least not until now. "But why would she still be here?" Jenny asked. "Why would she keep walking like that?" Mrs. Delaney shook her head. "I don't know. Maybe she's trapped, reliving the night she died. Maybe she's searching for something. But whatever it is, it's been happening ever since she passed. Some tenants have heard it, others haven't. But those who have, they all say the same thing." "What did they say?" Jenny asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Delaney's eyes darkened. They say the footsteps are getting closer. That night, Jenny lay in bed, wide awake, her mind racing. She tried to tell herself that Mrs. Delaney was just superstitious, that there was a logical explanation for the footsteps. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. The footsteps weren't just random noises or the creaking of an old building. They were deliberate, purposeful, as if someone or something was walking just above her head. At exactly 10 p.m., the footsteps started again. This time, Jenny felt a chill run down her spine as she listened. The pattern was the same as before, slow, measured steps, back and forth, back and forth. But now, they seemed louder, more deliberate. And as Mrs. Delaney had warned, they seemed to be getting closer. For hours, Jenny lay in bed, listening to the footsteps. She tried to block them out, but they were impossible to ignore. Each step seemed to echo through the room, filling her with a sense of unease that she couldn't shake. At around 2 a.m., the footsteps suddenly stopped. Jenny sat up in bed, her heart racing. She listened intently, waiting for the sound to start again, but the apartment above was silent. Then, just as she was about to relax, she heard it soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Footsteps. But this time they weren't coming from the apartment above. They were coming from the hallway outside her door. Jenny's blood ran cold as she listened to the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps moving closer to her apartment. She held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest, as the footsteps stopped just outside her door. For a long moment, there was silence. Then she heard the faint sound of someone knocking on her door. Jenny's mind raced. Should she answer? Should she call for help? But before she could decide, the knocking stopped, and the footsteps began again, moving away from her door and back down the hallway. For the rest of the night, Jenny didn't move from her bed. She lay there, her body tense, listening as the footsteps faded into the distance. The next morning, Jenny decided she couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. Whatever was happening in the building, whether it was the ghost of the girl from Unit 3 billion or something else, she couldn't live with the constant fear and unease. She packed up her things and moved out that same week. As she left the building for the last time, she glanced up at the window of Unit 3 billion. For a brief moment, she thought she saw a figure standing there, watching her. But when she blinked, the figure was gone. Jenny never looked back. Thank you for listening to this unsettling tale of haunted footsteps and eerie neighbors. Have you ever experienced something strange or unexplainable in your apartment or home? Share your stories with us in the comments below. We'd love to hear them. If this story gave you chills, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell so you never miss a new spooky story. Your support helps us continue to bring you more terrifying and mysterious tales. Stay safe, and remember to listen closely. You never know who or what might be walking just above you. When Rachel moved into her new apartment, she was filled with excitement. It was her first time living alone, and the cozy one-bedroom unit in a small complex seemed perfect for her needs. The rent was affordable, the neighborhood was quiet, and the building was tucked away in a peaceful, tree-lined area at the edge of town. It felt like a fresh start, away from the chaos of her previous apartment, where the noise from traffic and late-night parties had made it impossible to relax. Her new apartment complex had only 6 units, and her neighbors seemed polite but distant. Rachel liked that. She wasn't looking to make friends with the people around her. She just wanted peace, quiet, and a place where she could unwind after long days at work. The first few weeks in the new apartment went smoothly. Rachel spent her evenings decorating the space, hanging up artwork, and getting used to the layout. She loved how the large windows let in plenty of light during the day and gave her a view of the courtyard outside. It wasn't a bustling area, just a small patch of grass with a few trees and a communal bench, but it was pleasant enough, and Rachel felt at home. It was a few weeks later, on an unusually quiet evening, when things began to take a strange turn. Rachel had just finished watching a movie and was getting ready for bed. She dimmed the lights, pulled her curtains halfway closed, and got into bed with a book. As she lay there reading, she felt a slight chill run down her spine, as if someone was watching her. She glanced around the room, then towards the window, but nothing seemed out of place. The curtains were partially drawn, and the courtyard outside was dark and empty. She shrugged off the feeling, convincing herself that it was just the remnants of the suspenseful movie she had watched. She closed her book and drifted off to sleep. The next night, the feeling returned. Rachel was sitting on the couch, working on her laptop, when she suddenly felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The room was warm, and there was no draft, but that eerie sensation of being watched crept over her again. This time, she got up and walked over to the window. She pulled the curtain aside and peered out into the courtyard. Everything looked normal, quiet, and still, with no signs of movement. The lights from the neighboring apartments were dim, and there was no one in the courtyard below. Rachel stood there for a moment, watching before letting the curtain fall back into place. She tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, but found it harder than before. Over the next few nights, the sensation grew stronger. No matter where she was in the apartment, whether in bed, on the couch, or at the kitchen table, Rachel felt like she was being watched. The feeling was impossible to ignore, and it made her uncomfortable in her own home. But each time she checked the window, nothing seemed amiss. It wasn't until the following week that things took a darker turn. Rachel had fallen asleep early that night, exhausted from a long day at work. But around 2 a.m., she woke up suddenly, her heart pounding in her chest. She lay still, trying to figure out what had woken her. At first, everything seemed normal. The apartment was silent, and the curtains were drawn. But then she noticed a faint glow coming from the crack in the curtains, as if someone was outside, shining a light toward her window. Her pulse quickened. Rachel lay there for a moment, staring at the sliver of light, wondering if she was imagining things. But the glow didn't go away, it stayed, faint but steady. Finally, her curiosity and fear got the better of her. She quietly got out of bed, her bare feet silent on the floor, and crept over to the window. She pulled the curtain aside, just enough to peek outside. Her heart froze. Standing in the courtyard, directly across from her window, was a man. He was dressed in dark clothing and was staring up at her apartment, his face partially obscured by the shadows. The light she had seen was from his phone, which he was holding in one hand while using the other to shield his eyes from the street lamp. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she quickly let the curtain fall back into place. Her mind raced. Who was he? Why was he standing there in the middle of the night, staring up at her window? She hadn't heard of any break-ins in the area, but the sight of him watching her so intently filled her with dread. She considered calling the police, but by the time she gathered the courage to peek out again, the man was gone. The courtyard was empty, the only sound the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. Rachel spent the rest of the night wide awake, her heart pounding, her mind spinning with fear. She checked the locks on her doors and windows multiple times, making sure everything was secure, but sleep didn't come easily. The next day, Rachel couldn't shake the memory of the man's face. She tried to convince herself that maybe he was just a neighbor passing by, someone who had stopped for a moment, perhaps to look at his phone. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the case. The way he had been standing there, staring up at her window, felt deliberate, invasive. Over the next few days, Rachel kept the curtains closed, even during the day. The feeling of being watched didn't go away, and she began to grow increasingly paranoid. Every time she walked past a window, she would glance outside, half expecting to see the man standing there again. But he didn't return. At least not at first. A week later, Rachel was returning home late from work. The sun had already set, and the streetlights cast long shadows across the courtyard. As she unlocked her front door, she felt that familiar chill run down her spine, the sensation of eyes on her. She quickly glanced around, scanning the area for any signs of movement. And then she saw him. The same man was standing at the edge of the courtyard, half hidden behind one of the large trees. He wasn't holding his phone this time, but he was staring directly at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Rachel's heart raced as she fumbled with her keys, her hands trembling. She managed to get inside and slam the door shut, locking it behind her. She leaned against the door, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Who was this man, and why was he watching her? Rachel didn't sleep at all that night. She sat on her couch, the curtains drawn tightly, her phone in hand, debating whether or not to call the police. But what could she tell them? A man had been standing in the courtyard. He hadn't done anything, at least, not yet. But the fear gnawing at her wouldn't go away. Over the next few days, Rachel became hypervigilant. She double-checked the locks on her doors and windows multiple times a day and installed new, heavier curtains that blocked out more light. She even bought a security camera, which she installed in the living room facing the window. The feeling of being watched never left her, but she hoped the camera would at least provide some peace of mind. But the camera didn't bring peace. It only made things worse. 2 nights later, Rachel was woken up by the sound of her phone buzzing. It was a notification from the security camera app, alerting her to movement detected in the living room. Her heart skipped a beat as she grabbed her phone and opened the app. The camera feed showed her darkened living room, the curtains drawn tightly shut. But there, in the middle of the screen, was the unmistakable glow of a flashlight coming from outside the window. Rachel's blood ran cold. She watched, frozen in fear, as the light moved slowly across the window, illuminating the edges of the curtains. The man was back, and this time he was closer than ever. For a few moments, Rachel sat in bed, paralyzed with fear. She wanted to call the police, but she couldn't seem to make her fingers work. All she could do was stare at the camera feed, watching as the light continued to dance across the window, taunting her. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the light disappeared. Rachel jumped out of bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She ran to the window, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She pulled the curtains aside, half expecting to see the man standing there. But the courtyard was empty. Rachel's mind raced as she tried to process what had just happened. She replayed the camera footage, watching as the light flickered across the window. But the man had never come into view. He had been standing just out of sight, hiding in the shadows. That was the final straw. The next morning, Rachel called the police. When the officer arrived, Rachel explained everything: the man watching her from the courtyard, the feeling of being watched for weeks, the flashlight outside her window. The officer was sympathetic, but there wasn't much he could do. Without any concrete evidence of wrongdoing, all he could do was file a report and suggest that Rachel keep her doors and windows locked. He hasn't tried to break in, the officer said, his tone calm but firm. But it's good that you're being cautious. If you see him again, call us immediately. Rachel nodded, though the officer's words didn't bring much comfort. She couldn't shake the feeling that the man was biding his time, waiting for the right moment. That night, Rachel barely slept. Every sound, every creak, every gust of wind made her jump. She kept her phone by her side, ready to call the police at the slightest sign of trouble. But the man didn't come back. Not that night, anyway. For the next few days, things were eerily quiet. Rachel started to wonder if maybe the man had finally given up. Maybe the sight of the security camera had scared him off. But the feeling of being watched never truly left her. And then, one night, just as she was beginning to feel a little safer, it happened again. Rachel was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, when she felt it, the unmistakable sensation of eyes on her. Her pulse quickened, and she glanced toward the window. The curtains were drawn, but that familiar chill ran down her spine. She stood up, her heart racing, and slowly approached the window. Her hand trembled as she reached for the curtain, but before she could pull it aside, there was a knock at the door. Rachel froze. The knock came again, soft but deliberate. Her heart pounded in her chest as she slowly backed away from the window and approached the door. She peered through the peephole, expecting to see the man from the courtyard. But the hallway was empty. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She stood there for a moment, her mind racing. She knew someone had knocked. She had heard it clearly, but there was no one there. A sudden feeling of dread washed over her, and she quickly locked the door, her hands shaking. She backed away, her mind spinning with fear. That night, Rachel barely slept. Every sound, every creak of the old building sent her heart racing. She felt like a prisoner in her own apartment, trapped by the fear of what might be lurking outside. A few days later, Rachel decided she couldn't take it anymore. The constant feeling of being watched, the strange man, the knocks at the door, it was all too much. She packed up her things and moved out of the apartment, leaving behind the fear and paranoia that had consumed her life. But even now, months later, Rachel still can't shake the feeling that someone is watching her. When Sarah and her husband Michael moved into their new neighborhood, they thought they had found the perfect place to raise their young children. The house was a charming two-story with a white picket fence, and the street was quiet, lined with tall oak trees. The neighbors seemed friendly, and the local elementary school was only a few blocks away. It felt like the quintessential suburban dream. For the first few months, everything was peaceful. Sarah spent her days settling into the house, decorating the kids' rooms, and getting to know some of the other families on the street. There was Mrs. Henderson next door, an older woman who always waved and brought over freshly baked cookies, and the Winters family across the street, who had 2 children around the same age as Sarah's kids. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew each other, and Sarah felt lucky to have found it. But there was one neighbor who stood out from the rest. The house next door to Sarah's on the other side of the fence belonged to a woman named Becky and her teenage son Ethan. Becky was a single mother, and from the moment Sarah met her, she sensed something wasn't quite right. Becky was standoffish and cold, rarely making eye contact or engaging in conversation. Whenever Sarah tried to wave or say hello, Becky would either ignore her or respond with a curt nod before hurrying inside. At first, Sarah didn't think much of it. Not everyone was friendly, and Becky might have just been going through a rough time. But as the weeks went by, Sarah started noticing more troubling things about her new neighbor. It began with the shouting. Late at night, when the rest of the neighborhood was quiet, Sarah would hear loud arguments coming from Becky's house. At first, it was just muffled voices, angry but indistinct. But soon, the shouting became louder and more frequent. She could hear Becky screaming at her son, the words harsh and cruel. "Why can't you do anything right?" Becky would shout. "You're useless." The sounds of crashing objects followed, as if things were being thrown across the room. Sarah's heart ached for Ethan, imagining what it must be like for him to live with such anger and violence. Sarah tried to ignore it at first, telling herself it wasn't her place to intervene. But the arguments became more intense, and she started to worry about Ethan's safety. One night, after a particularly loud fight, Sarah decided to do something about it. She called the non-emergency police line and reported a domestic disturbance. The police arrived a short while later, but by the time they knocked on Becky's door, the shouting had stopped. Sarah watched from her window as Becky answered the door, her face calm and composed. She spoke to the officers for a few minutes, her body language casual, and then they left. Nothing changed. The fights continued, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes in the middle of the day. Sarah didn't know what to do. She didn't want to cause more trouble for Ethan, but she couldn't stand by and do nothing. Then one afternoon, Sarah heard a knock at her door. She opened it to find Becky standing on her porch, her arms crossed and her expression tight. "I know it was you who called the cops," Becky said, her voice low and accusing. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected Becky to confront her directly. "I was just worried," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice calm. "I heard a lot of shouting, and I thought someone might be in trouble." Becky's eyes narrowed. "You don't know anything about me or my son," she snapped. "We don't need your help, and we definitely don't need you sticking your nose in our business. Next time you hear something, keep it to yourself." Before Sarah could respond, Becky turned and stormed off, slamming the gate behind her as she left. Shaken, Sarah closed the door and leaned against it, her heart pounding. She didn't know what to do. The last thing she wanted was to make things worse for Ethan, but it was clear that Becky wasn't going to change. Over the next few weeks, the situation escalated. The shouting became more violent, and Sarah began to hear disturbing noises, thuds, crashes, the sound of things breaking. She could only imagine what was happening inside that house, and every time she heard Ethan's name screamed in anger, her stomach turned. One evening, while Sarah was putting her kids to bed, she heard a loud crash from next door, followed by Ethan's voice, pleading and scared. "Please, Mom, stop. I didn't do anything." Sarah's heart raced as she listened to the boy's desperate cries. She rushed to the window and peered through the blinds, hoping to catch a glimpse of what was happening. But all she could see was the dark outline of Becky's house. Without hesitating, Sarah grabbed her phone and dialed Child Protective Services CPS. She explained what had been happening, how often she heard the fights, and her concern for Ethan's safety. The woman on the other end of the line listened patiently and assured Sarah that someone would be sent to investigate. Days passed, and Sarah waited anxiously for any sign of change. She didn't see much of Becky or Ethan during the day, and at night, the shouting continued. But she didn't regret making the call to CPS. If it meant getting Ethan out of that dangerous environment, it was worth it. One afternoon, Sarah was sitting on her porch when she saw a CPS worker pull up in front of Becky's house. The woman knocked on the door, clipboard in hand, and Becky answered after a few moments. Sarah couldn't hear what they were saying, but it was clear that Becky was not happy about the visit. Her face was red, her body language tense and defensive. After a few minutes of conversation, the CPS worker left, and Becky slammed the door behind her. Sarah watched, hoping that maybe this would be the wake-up call Becky needed. But instead of improving, things got worse. That night, the shouting was louder than ever. Sarah could hear Becky screaming at Ethan, her voice filled with rage. There was a crash, followed by Ethan's cries, and then more yelling. Sarah felt sick to her stomach. She had done everything she could, but nothing seemed to be working. The CPS visit had only made Becky angrier, and now Ethan was paying the price. Then, one evening, something happened that changed everything. It was late around midnight, and Sarah had just gone to bed when she heard a commotion from next door. It wasn't the usual shouting, this was different. There were loud thuds, the sound of furniture being knocked over, and then a door slamming. Sarah jumped out of bed and rushed to the window. She could see Becky standing in the front yard, her face twisted in anger. She was screaming into the house, her voice hoarse and frantic. "You think you can leave me?" she shouted. "You're not going anywhere." A few moments later, Ethan ran out the front door, his backpack slung over his shoulder. His face was pale, and there were tears streaming down his cheeks. He looked terrified. Becky lunged toward him, but Ethan was faster. He sprinted across the yard and down the street, disappearing into the darkness. Sarah's heart was racing as she watched the scene unfold. She knew she had to do something, but before she could make a move, Becky stormed back into the house, slamming the door behind her. The next morning, Sarah knocked on Mrs. Henderson's door, hoping to find out what had happened. "Did you hear what went on last night?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Mrs. Henderson nodded grimly. "I did. That poor boy. I've been worried about him for a long time. I heard he ran away." Sarah's heart sank. She had been worried for Ethan, but the thought of him out there, alone, scared her even more. "Do you think he'll be okay?" she asked. Mrs. Henderson sighed. "I don't know, dear. I hope so. I think he's been trying to get away from her for a long time. Maybe now he'll finally be safe." For the next few days, there was no sign of Ethan. Sarah didn't hear any more shouting from Becky's house, and the neighborhood was eerily quiet. She didn't know where Ethan had gone, but she prayed that he had found a safe place. A week later, Sarah saw Becky sitting on her front porch, her face drawn and tired. She looked like a shell of the woman she had been before. There were dark circles under her eyes, and she sat hunched over, her hands shaking. Sarah wasn't sure what to say. She wanted to comfort Becky, to offer her some kind of support, but she also knew that Becky had caused so much pain both to Ethan and to herself. As she stood there, watching Becky from a distance, Sarah's phone buzzed. It was a notification from the local news website. She opened it and felt her heart stop. "Runaway teen found safe." The article explained that Ethan had been found by a family friend and was now in the care of Child Protective Services. He was safe, finally, after months, maybe years of enduring his mother's abuse. Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Ethan was safe. That was all that mattered. Over the next few weeks, Becky's house remained quiet. Sarah didn't see much of her, and she assumed that Becky had finally realized what she had done. Sarah didn't know what would happen next, whether Becky would lose custody of Ethan, or whether she would try to get him back, but she hoped that the boy would finally get the help he needed. Months later, the house next door was put up for sale. Becky had moved away, and the house was empty. Sarah never saw her again, but she would always remember the fear and pain that had filled that house. Ethan's story stuck with Sarah for a long time. She often thought about him, hoping that he had found a new home, a place where he could heal and grow without the fear of violence and anger hanging over him. And every time she heard a loud noise from her own house, her children playing, a door slamming, she was reminded of how fragile safety and peace could be, and how important it was to speak up when something was wrong. The locked basement door. When my husband and I bought our first house, it was a fixer-upper, to say the least. The price was right, and the location was perfect, far enough from the city to feel like a peaceful retreat, but close enough for the daily commute. The house was old, though, and had been vacant for years. It needed a lot of work, but we were excited to make it our own. One of the first things we noticed about the house was the basement door. It was locked, solidly locked, with no key in sight. The realtor had mentioned it casually when we toured the house, brushing it off as just an old storage room the previous owners had sealed up. At the time, we didn't think much of it. There were plenty of other projects to focus on, and the basement wasn't a priority. But as we settled into the house, the locked door started to bother me. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something strange about it. It wasn't just that the door was locked, it was the way it seemed to stand out from the rest of the house. The door itself was older than the others, with heavy iron hinges and a large, rusted lock. The rest of the house had been updated over the years, but the basement door remained untouched, like a relic from a different time. One evening, after a long day of painting and fixing up the living room, I found myself standing in front of the door, staring at the lock. Curiosity gnawed at me. What was behind it? Why had the previous owners locked it so securely? Maybe we should call a locksmith, I suggested to my husband, who was sitting on the couch, flipping through a home improvement magazine. He glanced up at me and shrugged. Yeah, eventually. But we've got plenty of other things to worry about first. It's probably just old junk down there. I nodded, trying to push the thought out of my mind, but over the next few weeks, the door became an obsession. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I passed by, I felt a strange pull, like it was calling to me, urging me to open it. I started having dreams about the basement, dark, claustrophobic dreams where I was trapped behind the door, pounding on it, screaming to be let out. One day I couldn't take it anymore. While my husband was at work, I grabbed a hammer and a crowbar from the garage and went to the basement door. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, but then I jammed the crowbar into the lock and pried it loose. The lock broke with a loud snap, and the door swung open with a groan. A cold, damp smell wafted up from the darkness below. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and shone it down the stairs. The beam of light barely pierced the blackness, but I could make out the stone steps leading down into the basement. I took a deep breath and started down the stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The walls were made of rough stone, and the ceiling was low, forcing me to duck as I descended. The basement was larger than I had expected, the space stretching out into the darkness beyond the reach of my flashlight. There were shelves along the walls, filled with old jars and dusty boxes. An old workbench sat in one corner, covered in tools that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. But as I moved further into the basement, something else caught my eye, something that made my blood run cold. In the far corner of the basement, hidden in the shadows, was another door. This one was much older, made of heavy, weathered wood with large iron hinges. It was partially ajar, and a faint light seemed to be coming from the other side. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the door, my flashlight trembling in my hand. I reached out and pushed the door open the rest of the way, revealing a small, stone room beyond. Inside the room was a single chair, and sitting in that chair was a figure. At first, I thought it was a mannequin or some kind of old, forgotten decoration. The figure was slumped over, its clothes tattered and covered in dust. But as I shone the light on its face, I realized with horror that it wasn't a mannequin. It was a person, a corpse. The body was skeletal, the skin dried and stretched tight over the bones, the eye sockets empty. The clothes were old, outdated, like something from the early 1900s. My breath caught in my throat. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. The beam of light spun wildly as the flashlight hit the floor, casting long shadows across the room. That's when I saw its scratches on the walls. Deep, desperate scratches, as if the person had tried to claw their way out. I turned and ran, my heart pounding, my breath ragged as I scrambled up the stairs and slammed the basement door shut behind me. I locked it again, my hands shaking, and backed away, staring at the door as if it might open on its own. When my husband got home, I told him what I had found. At first, he didn't believe me, but when we went back down to the basement together, the room was gone. The door, the chair, the body, everything. It was as if none of it had ever been there. But I know what I saw. And I haven't been able to go down to the basement since. The reflection in the pond. Growing up, I spent most of my summers at my grandparents' farmhouse. They lived in a quiet, rural area surrounded by fields and forests, far from the noise and bustle of the city. The house was old, but it had a warm, comforting feel to it, like it had been lived in and loved for generations. Behind the farmhouse, at the edge of the woods, was a small pond. It was one of my favorite places to explore as a child. The water was calm and clear, reflecting the trees and the sky like a mirror. My grandfather used to tell me stories about the pond, old tales passed down through the family about how the pond had been there for hundreds of years, long before the farmhouse was built. But there was one story he told me that I never forgot. He said the pond had a secret, a strange, eerie secret that had been whispered about for generations. According to the legend, the pond didn't just reflect the world around it, it reflected something else, something darker. It only happens at night, my grandfather had said, his voice low and serious, when the moon is full and the water is perfectly still sometimes. You'll see things in the pond that aren't really there, things that shouldn't be there. As a kid, I thought it was just a story, something to scare me into staying away from the pond after dark. But the older I got, the more I began to wonder if there was any truth to it. One summer, when I was about 16, I decided to find out for myself. It was late, just past midnight, and the farmhouse was quiet. My grandparents were asleep, and the only sound was the soft chirping of crickets outside. I slipped out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and made my way out to the pond. The night was clear, and the moon was full, casting a pale glow over the landscape. The pond was perfectly still, the surface like glass, reflecting the stars and the trees with eerie precision. I sat down on the grass by the edge of the pond, watching the reflection. For a long time, nothing happened. The water remained calm, and the reflection stayed the same, a mirror image of the world around me. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. I turned my head quickly, but the pond was empty. The trees stood still, their branches motionless in the soft breeze. I frowned, telling myself it was just my imagination, and turned back to the pond. That's when I saw it. In the reflection, just beyond the edge of the trees, was a figure. A person standing at the edge of the pond, staring into the water. My heart skipped a beat. I looked up, scanning the trees, but there was no one there. The figure wasn't real, it was only in the reflection. I glanced back down at the water, my hands trembling. The figure was still there, standing perfectly still, their face hidden in the shadows. I couldn't make out any details, just the shape of a person, watching me from the other side of the reflection. I stood up slowly, backing away from the edge of the pond, my heart racing. But the figure didn't move. It stayed there, unmoving, its gaze fixed on the water. I turned and ran back to the farmhouse, not stopping until I was inside with the door locked behind me. My chest heaved as I caught my breath, my mind racing. What had I just seen? Who or what was that figure in the pond? The next morning I went back to the pond, but the reflection was normal. There was no sign of the figure, no hint that anything strange had happened the night before. But I know what I saw. And now, every time I visit my grandparents and walk by that pond, I feel a cold chill run down my spine, wondering if the figure is still there, waiting for the next full moon. The vanishing house. I was driving home late one night, the kind of late where the roads are empty and the world feels deserted. It had been a long day at work, and I was exhausted, eager to get home, crawl into bed, and forget the day ever happened. The drive was familiar, a quiet, rural route I'd taken countless times before. But that night, something was different. As I rounded a bend in the road, I saw a house that I had never noticed before. It sat back from the road, partially hidden by a line of trees, but the soft glow of lights from the windows caught my eye. I slowed down, squinting into the darkness, trying to get a better look. The house was large Victorian style, with a wraparound porch and tall, narrow windows. It looked old, but well kept, with ivy climbing up the stone walls and flickering lanterns on either side of the front door. It was beautiful, but strange. I had driven this road for years and had never seen this house before. I pulled over to the side of the road, curiosity gnawing at me. How could I have missed a house like this? I glanced around, but the road was empty, and there were no other cars in sight. The air was still, the only sound the soft hum of my engine. For a moment, I considered getting out of the car, walking up to the house to see if anyone was home. But something about the house made me hesitate. It was too quiet, too perfect, like it didn't belong here. After a few minutes, I shook my head, chalking it up to exhaustion. Maybe I had just never noticed the house before. I was tired, after all, and my mind was probably playing tricks on me. I put the car in gear and drove away, the house disappearing in my rearview mirror. The next day, the memory of the house lingered in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something about it wasn't right. So on my way home from work, I decided to take the same route and see if the house was still there. But when I reached the spot where I had seen it, the house was gone. I slowed down, my heart racing. I was sure this was the place right where the house had been the night before. But now there was nothing, just an empty field, overgrown with tall grass and wildflowers. No house, no driveway, nothing. I pulled over again, staring at the empty space. How could it be gone? Had I imagined it? But the memory of the house was so clear, too clear to be a figment of my imagination. I got out of the car, walking through the field where the house should have been. The grass was thick and undisturbed, as if no one had set foot here in years. I walked to the edge of the tree line, searching for any sign of the house, a foundation, a fence, anything, but there was nothing. I stood there for a long time, trying to make sense of what I had seen. The house had been real, I was sure of it, but now it was as if it had never existed at all. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I took the same route home every night, hoping to see the house again, but it never appeared. The field remained empty, the road deserted. I even asked some of the locals about it, but no one knew anything about a house in that area. It's been months now, and I still don't have an explanation. Every time I drive down that road, I half expect to see the house again, sitting there in the shadows, waiting. But it's never there. And I can't shake the feeling that one night when I least expect it, the house will return just for me. The disappearing friend. It was supposed to be a quick weekend getaway, just me and my friend Elliot, heading up to the cabin in the mountains for a few days of hiking and relaxation. The cabin belonged to his family, and we had been there a few times before, enjoying the peace and quiet far away from the bustle of the city. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already dipping behind the peaks, casting long shadows over the forest. The cabin was nestled in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pine trees, with a small stream running nearby. It was perfect, isolated, quiet, and exactly what we needed. That first night was uneventful. We unpacked, made a simple dinner, and sat by the fireplace, talking and drinking, until the fire died down. It was late by the time we went to bed, the sounds of the forest lulling us to sleep. The next morning, Elliot was gone. At first, I didn't think much of it. He was an early riser, and I figured he had gone for a walk, or maybe down to the stream. I made myself some coffee and waited for him to come back, but as the hours passed, I started to worry. I called out for him, walked around the cabin, checking the trails and the stream, but there was no sign of him. His phone, wallet, and keys were still in the cabin, but he was nowhere to be found. I spent the rest of the day searching, my panic growing with each passing hour. I called his name over and over, hiking through the woods, following the trails we had taken so many times before. But there was nothing, no sign of him, no tracks, nothing. By nightfall, I was desperate. I grabbed a flashlight and headed back out into the woods, calling his name, hoping, praying that he would answer. And then, in the distance, I heard it. A voice faint, muffled, calling my name. My heart leaped in my chest. "Elliot," I shouted, shining the flashlight into the trees. "Where are you?" The voice came again, closer this time, but still faint, as if it were coming from far away, or from behind something. I followed the sound, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, my heart pounding with both fear and relief. But as I moved deeper into the woods, the voice grew fainter, as if it were slipping away from me. I called out again, but this time there was no response, just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. I stopped, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and listened. The woods were silent. I stood there for a long time, shining the flashlight into the darkness, hoping to catch a glimpse of him, but there was nothing. No voice, no movement, just the oppressive stillness of the forest. I turned back toward the cabin, my mind racing. Where could he have gone? How could he have just disappeared? The next morning, I drove into town and reported him missing. The local authorities organized a search party, and for the next few days we combed the area, searching the trails, the woods, the stream, but there was no trace of him. It was as if Elliot had vanished into thin air. Weeks passed, and eventually the search was called off. There were no leads, no evidence, nothing to suggest where he had gone or what had happened. The case was left open, but there were no answers. But here's the thing, every now and then I hear him. I'll be lying in bed at night, or sitting alone in the quiet, and I'll hear his voice faint, distant, calling my name. I know it's impossible. I know Elliot is gone. But still, the voice comes, pulling me back to that night in the woods, reminding me of the friend I lost. And I can't help but wonder if I follow the voice again. If I go back to the cabin and listen closely, will I find him? Or will I disappear too? The wrong hotel room. I had been on the road for hours, and exhaustion was beginning to weigh heavily on me. My original plan was to drive straight through the night to my destination, but after a long day of travel and meetings, I decided it wasn't worth the risk. When I saw a highway sign for a small, off-the-beaten-path motel, I decided to pull in and get a few hours of sleep before continuing. The motel looked run down but serviceable, one of those places where you could tell its best years were long behind it. The neon sign flickered dimly, casting a dull red glow over the parking lot. A few other cars were parked, but the place was otherwise quiet. The man at the front desk didn't say much as I checked in. He slid a room key across the counter with a tired, uninterested expression and gestured toward the stairs. Room 112, second floor, he muttered, barely looking up from the old TV that played static in the corner. I took the key and made my way upstairs, grateful just to have a bed to collapse into. The hallways were dimly lit, the carpets worn and faded. As I reached my room, I fumbled with the old metal key, eventually managing to unlock the door. The room was exactly what you'd expect a standard, outdated motel room with a bed, a small desk, and a TV that looked like it hadn't been turned on in years. But it was clean enough, and all I needed was a few hours of sleep. I dropped my bag on the floor, kicked off my shoes, and lay down on the bed without even bothering to undress. The sheets smelled faintly of bleach, and I pulled the blanket up to my chin, closing my eyes, hoping sleep would come quickly. But it didn't. Instead, I started to hear noises small, almost imperceptible at first, like the faint creak of floorboards or the rustling of fabric. At first, I thought it was just the sounds of the old building settling, or maybe a guest in the room next door. But as I lay there, the noises grew louder, more distinct. It sounded like breathing. My eyes snapped open, and I stared up at the ceiling, listening intently. The breathing was soft but unmistakable, coming from somewhere in the room. I froze, my pulse quickening, straining to hear more. Was someone in the room with me? I slowly turned my head, scanning the dark corners of the room, but there was no one. The door was still shut, the room as empty as it had been when I walked in. But the breathing continued, steady and rhythmic, like someone was standing just out of sight, watching me. My skin prickled with fear. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest, and grabbed the remote to turn on the TV, hoping the noise would drown out whatever it was I was hearing. The TV flickered to life, casting a dull glow across the room. I sat there for a few moments, staring blankly at the screen, trying to calm my racing heart. The breathing had stopped, or at least I couldn't hear it over the sound of the TV. I tried to convince myself that I was just tired, that it was my mind playing tricks on me. But something about the room felt wrong. The air was too still, too thick, like it was pressing in on me. After a few minutes, I turned off the TV, deciding to try and get some sleep. But as soon as the room went dark again, I heard the breathing. Only this time it was closer. I bolted upright, adrenaline coursing through my veins, and flicked on the bedside lamp. The dim yellow light flooded the room, but there was no one there. I was alone. But the sound of breathing, it hadn't stopped. It was coming from the closet. I stared at the closed closet door, my hands shaking, my mind racing. The breathing was louder now, as if someone or something was standing right behind the door, waiting. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to open that door. But I had to know. I couldn't just sit there, listening to whatever was lurking in the dark. Slowly, I climbed out of bed, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I took a step toward the closet, then another. The breathing grew louder with every step I took, like it was drawing me in. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. I hesitated for a moment, my breath catching in my throat. Then, with a surge of fear and adrenaline, I yanked the door open. The closet was empty. I stood there, staring into the dark, empty space, my mind reeling. The breathing had stopped, and there was nothing inside, no person, no creature, nothing. Just a few wire hangers clinking softly as they swayed on the rod. I slammed the closet door shut and backed away, my hands shaking. I grabbed my bag, threw on my shoes, and left the room without looking back. I didn't bother checking out at the front desk. I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there. I drove through the night, the memory of the breathing echoing in my mind, and didn't stop until I reached the next town. I don't know what was in that room, but I'm certain of one thing: I wasn't alone in there. The phantom passenger. I've been driving for a rideshare service for about a year now. The job's easy enough, and it pays the bills. Most of the rides are uneventful: pick up, drop off, and repeat. But there was one night, one ride that I'll never forget. It was late, well past midnight, and I was driving through a quiet part of town, hoping to squeeze in a few more rides before calling it a night. The streets were empty, the city asleep. My phone pinged with a new ride request, and I glanced at the screen. The pickup location was about 10 minutes away, just outside of downtown. I accepted the request and made my way to the location. It was an old, quiet neighborhood with narrow streets lined with tall, shadowy trees. As I pulled up to the address, I noticed a man standing on the corner, just under a flickering streetlight. He was dressed in a dark jacket, his face partially hidden by the hood. I rolled down the window slightly and called out, "Hey, you the one who called for a ride?" He nodded silently and opened the back door, slipping into the seat behind me without a word. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror, but he was staring out the window, his face still obscured by the hood. Something about him felt off, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe he was just tired or had had a rough night. "Where do?" I asked, glancing at the GPS. "The cemetery," he said, his voice low and flat. I hesitated for a moment, a chill running down my spine. The cemetery was about 20 minutes away, on the outskirts of town. It wasn't the kind of place people typically went to at this hour, but who was I to question it? People had their reasons. "All right," I said, punching the destination into the GPS. The ride was quiet, too quiet. The man in the back didn't speak, didn't move. He just sat there, staring out the window, his hands resting in his lap. The silence felt thick, heavy, like the air itself was pressing down on me. I tried to make small talk, hoping to ease the tension. "So, you meeting someone at the cemetery?" "No," he said simply. I swallowed hard and focused on the road, the city lights fading as we drove further out into the countryside. The roads became narrower, darker, the trees lining the streets casting long, shadowy shapes across the car. The tension in the air grew thicker, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting the man to say something, to explain why he was going to the cemetery so late at night. But he didn't. He just sat there, still as a statue. We finally reached the cemetery, the large iron gates looming ahead in the darkness. I slowed the car and pulled up to the entrance, my nerves on edge. "Here we are," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The man didn't respond. He just sat there, staring out the window, unmoving. You okay?" I asked, glancing back at him. Still, no response. I turned in my seat, ready to say something else, but the back seat was empty. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The door hadn't opened, the seatbelt was still fastened, but the man was gone. I blinked, staring at the empty seat, my mind racing. Had he gotten out without me noticing? No, that was impossible. I had been watching him the whole time. I got out of the car, my hands shaking, and looked around. The cemetery was silent, the gravestones barely visible in the dim moonlight. There was no sign of the man, no footprints, no movement, nothing. I stood there for a long time, staring into the darkness, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there were no answers. I climbed back into the car, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel, and drove away as fast as I could. I don't take late-night rides near the cemetery anymore, and I never saw that man again. The old woman at the park. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, the kind where the air feels fresh and the sky is a bright, cloudless blue. I had the day off work, so I decided to go for a walk in the park, a sprawling, peaceful place on the edge of town, with winding paths, towering trees, and benches scattered along the trails. It wasn't crowded, just a few people here and there, enjoying the last warm days before winter set in. As I wandered down one of the less traveled paths, I noticed her, an old woman, sitting alone on a bench. She was hunched over, her face hidden by a worn, wide-brimmed hat, her hands resting on her lap. She seemed out of place somehow, like she didn't belong there. The park was full of life children playing, couples walking their dogs, but she was still silent like a forgotten relic. I walked past her, giving her a polite nod as I did, but she didn't react. She didn't even move. Her posture remained rigid, her eyes fixed on the ground. Something about her gave me pause, a strange feeling of unease settling over me. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the way she sat there, unmoving, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I continued down the path, trying to shake the feeling. But as I walked, the thought of the old woman lingered in my mind. There was something unsettling about her. The park was peaceful, the perfect place to relax, yet she seemed tense, like she was waiting for something. After a while, I looped back around, curious to see if she was still there. As I approached the bench, my heart skipped a beat. She was gone. The bench was empty, the path deserted. I stopped, looking around. There were no other people nearby, no sign of the old woman. It was as if she had vanished. I frowned, glancing at the ground around the bench. There were no footprints, no marks in the dirt that suggested she had been there at all. The unease from earlier returned, stronger this time, gnawing at me. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty bench, trying to convince myself that it was nothing, that she had probably just gotten up and walked away while I wasn't looking. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I shook my head and continued on my walk, trying to enjoy the rest of the afternoon. But the image of the old woman stayed with me, the way she had sat there, so still, so silent, as if she were waiting for something or someone. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced out the window, half expecting to see the old woman standing there, watching me from the shadows. But the street was empty, and the only sound was the soft rustling of the wind. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. The park, the bench, the old woman, it all seemed so surreal now, like a strange dream that I couldn't quite wake from. A few days later, I went back to the park, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. As I walked the same path, I kept my eyes peeled for the old woman, hoping to catch a glimpse of her again. And then, there she was. She was sitting in the exact same spot as before, her posture rigid, her head bowed, her hands resting in her lap. It was as if she had never moved. My heart raced as I approached her, the feeling of unease growing stronger with every step. This time I stopped in front of her. "Excuse me," I said softly, my voice trembling. "Are you okay?" She didn't respond. She didn't even look up. She just sat there, as still as a statue, her face hidden beneath the brim of her hat. I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my chest. "Do you need help?" Still nothing. The silence was deafening. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before gently tapping her shoulder. The old woman's head snapped up and I gasped, stumbling back. Her eyes were hollow, empty sockets staring out at me from a face that was pale and lifeless. Her skin was stretched tight over her bones, her mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as she stared at me with those hollow, unseeing eyes. Without a word, she stood up, her movements jerky and unnatural, and began walking down the path, disappearing into the trees. I didn't move. I couldn't. My legs felt like they were made of stone, my heart racing in my chest. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring after her, my mind struggling to make sense of what I had just seen. When I finally found the courage to leave, I walked as quickly as I could back to my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I drove home in silence, my thoughts racing, unable to shake the image of the old woman's hollow eyes and twisted grin. I never went back to that park again. The midnight knock. It was late, well past midnight, when I heard the knock on my front door. At first, I thought I had imagined it. My house was quiet, and the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. But then it came again, 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Who would be knocking at this hour? I lived alone, and my house was on the outskirts of town, far enough away that visitors were rare, especially this late at night. I glanced at the clock, 2:13 a.m. The knocking came again, louder this time, more insistent. I stood up, my hands trembling as I moved toward the door. I peered through the peephole, expecting to see. Well, I didn't know what I expected to see, but the porch was empty. No one was there. My heart raced as I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The knocking came again, 3 loud, deliberate knocks, echoing through the quiet house. But there was no one outside. The porch light was on, illuminating the empty steps, and the street beyond was dark and deserted. I bit my lip, my pulse quickening. Maybe it was a prank. Kids playing around, trying to scare me. But why here? Why now? I stepped back from the door, trying to steady my breathing. The house was silent again, the knocking gone. I glanced out the window, scanning the yard for any movement, but there was nothing, just the quiet night, the empty street, and the soft rustling of the wind. I turned to go back to bed, but just as I did, I heard it another knock. But this time it wasn't at the front door. It was coming from inside the house. My breath caught in my throat, and I stood frozen in place, listening. The knock came again, soft but deliberate, echoing through the house. It sounded like it was coming from upstairs. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly crept toward the stairs, my hands shaking. The house was dark, the shadows long and eerie, and with each step I took, the knocking grew louder. When I reached the top of the stairs, I hesitated, staring down the hallway. The knock came again, louder now, coming from behind the door to the guest bedroom. I had never heard a sound like this before, slow, rhythmic, as if someone was on the other side of the door, tapping gently, waiting for me to open it. I swallowed hard, my hands trembling as I reached for the doorknob. With a deep breath, I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was empty. The bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn, and everything was exactly as I had left it. There was no one there, no sign of anyone or anything. I stepped into the room, scanning every corner, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was silent, still, but the air felt heavy, thick with a tension I couldn't explain. I stood there for a long moment, listening, waiting. And then, just as I was about to turn and leave, I heard it again. 3 soft knocks, coming from the wall behind the bed. I backed away slowly, my pulse racing, my mind spinning. The knocking continued, steady and deliberate, as if someone or something was trying to get my attention. I ran out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. I didn't know what to do, where to go. My house, which had always been my sanctuary, now felt strange, foreign, as if I didn't belong there anymore. The knocking didn't stop. It followed me through the house, moving from room to room, always just behind the walls, always just out of sight. It never grew louder, never more frantic, just that same slow, steady knocking, as if it had all the time in the world. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch, wide-eyed and trembling, listening to the knocks that seemed to echo endlessly through the house. The next morning, the knocking stopped. But I couldn't stay. I packed my things and left the house, unable to shake the feeling that whatever had been knocking was still there, waiting for me to return. And sometimes when I am alone in my new place, I swear I can still hear it, 3 soft, deliberate knocks, echoing in the distance. The silent passenger. I've been a taxi driver for nearly a decade now. Over the years, I've had all kinds of people in my cab, chatty tourists, tired commuters, even the occasional celebrity. But there was one ride late one night that I'll never forget. It was a quiet Tuesday around 1 a.m. I had been driving around aimlessly for hours, hoping to pick up a few more fares before calling it a night. The streets were empty, the city asleep, and I was beginning to think it was time to head home when I saw him. He was standing on the corner of an intersection, just outside the reach of the streetlights. His face was obscured by the brim of his hat, and his hands were stuffed into the pockets of his long coat. Something about the way he stood there, so still, so patient, made me hesitate. But business was business, and a fare was a fare. I pulled over and he approached the car silently. He opened the back door and slid into the seat behind me without a word. His movements were smooth, almost too smooth, and he sat there quietly, his face still hidden in the shadows. Where do I ask, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. He didn't respond right away. For a moment I thought maybe he hadn't heard me, but then, in a low, monotone voice, he said, "Take me to the old train station." I frowned. The old train station had been abandoned for years, ever since the city built a new one on the other side of town. No one went there anymore. It was boarded up, overgrown, and forgotten. "Are you sure?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. He nodded slowly, but didn't say anything else. I shrugged, started the meter, and pulled away from the curb. The silence in the car was heavy, oppressive. Most passengers would at least exchange a few words, but this guy didn't move, didn't speak. He just sat there, staring out the window. As we drove through the empty streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The man in the back seat seemed wrong somehow. His presence filled the car with a coldness that made my skin crawl. I kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror, hoping to catch a glimpse of his face, but the shadows seemed to cling to him, hiding his features. Finally, we arrived at the old train station. The place was as desolate as I remembered. Overgrown weeds covered the parking lot, and the building itself was a dark, hulking mass against the night sky. "We're here," I said, my voice a little shaky. "That'll be $10. The man didn't move. He just sat there, staring out at the station. "Sir," I said, turning slightly in my seat. "That'll be $10. Still nothing. He remained as still as a statue, his face still hidden by the shadows. I felt a chill run down my spine, and a growing sense of unease settled over me. I wasn't sure what to do. He wasn't responding, wasn't moving, and I didn't want to get out of the car to confront him. After a few moments of tense silence, I finally mustered up the courage to speak again. "Sir, you need to pay the fare." Slowly, the man turned his head toward me. I couldn't see his face, just the faint outline of his features, but something about the way he moved sent a wave of fear crashing over me. He leaned forward slightly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "The fare has been paid." I blinked, confused. "What do you mean? You haven't..." But when I looked down at the meter, it read 0. The fare had already been cleared. I stared at the meter, my mind racing. How had it reset? I hadn't touched it. And then I glanced back at the rearview mirror. The back seat was empty. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The door hadn't opened. There had been no sound, no movement, but the man was gone. I whipped around in my seat, my eyes scanning the back seat, but there was no one there. The seatbelt was still fastened, and the door was closed. It was as if he had simply vanished. I stared out at the old train station, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. The building loomed in the darkness, silent and foreboding. I didn't know what had just happened, but I wasn't about to stick around and find out. I slammed the car into gear and sped away, my heart racing the entire drive home. I don't pick up passengers near that part of town anymore. And whenever I drive past the old train station, I keep my eyes firmly on the road ahead, never looking back.